Preview.
Where then do UFOs fit into our newly expanding awareness of the paranormal? Perhaps investigative reporter Ralph Blum, author of Beyond Earth, a book about man's contact with UFOs, could answer that question for us. Mr. Blum, what do you think about the UFOs?
I think we have to consider them as an example of Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law says that if something can possibly happen, it will. There doesn't seem to be much doubt that UFOs are happening, that they are real physical objects occupying both physical space and time. But the data also implies that UFOs may not actually fly here over vast, enormous distances, but simply materialize here, function as physical craft while in our atmosphere, and then dematerialize. I've interviewed Air Force pilots whose mission was to acquire UFO footage, men who've tracked and photographed UFOs and then just watch them vanish. Professor J.H. Bruning of the University of Mississippi has pointed out how closely a UFO experience resembles a psychic event. In both instances, something that, according to the rigid rules of science, shouldn't be there, appears and violates the known laws of space and time and gravity. Ghosts and UFOs seem to have a lot in common. Ghosts materialize, seem to float or hover above the ground, often communicate telepathically, then dematerialize, just like the reports of UFOs and their crews. These and other fascinating phenomena such as time loss, teleportation, and spontaneous healing are all associated both with occult and UFO experiences. And I'm inclined to agree with astronomer Alan Hynek, who suggested that we may be dealing with an intelligence that knows more about the physical world than we do, more about the psychic world, and is using it all.
Mr. Blum, I understand that you got down to Pascagoula, Mississippi, just 36 hours after Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker had their UFO encounter.
Yes, I did. It was the first time I'd seen for myself the profoundly disturbing effect of such an experience, not only on the two men, but on the entire town. Nothing that powerful had happened to Pascagoula since Hurricane Camille hit the Gulf Coast. And it was quite impossible to sit in the same room with Charlie and Calvin and not believe that something terrifying had happened to them.
They had me one on this arm like this, and on the other one, you know, they had my other arm like that. And I just seemed to lift up to the same height they were off the ground, and we just moved into the craft.
Now, inside, how did they lay you out? Do you remember how it happened?
Yes. I didn't see any tables or chairs or anything in there. I'm not saying it wasn't in there because the light was almost blinding, but I didn't see any. And when they carried me inside, they seemed to just lean me back, you know. And this eye, well, I keep referring to it as an eye, it moved up in front of me about this close. Mm-hmm. And it started right at my eyes, looking me right in the eye. Uh-huh. And it hesitated there for a few seconds, and it just started moving over my entire body. When they brought me from the craft, they put along this area here, and they didn't drop me, you know, they just released me back to the ground. And I fell. I don't know why my legs were weak. I don't know why it was the fright or what it was, but I fell onto the ground. And that's when I seen Calvin. He's standing right over here in this area, and he was standing facing the river with his arms outstretched like that, just like he was staring at something.
A man in Missouri gave a paper on 546 landing cases from 34 countries. These all involve traces, that is, where some marks were left after the UFO took off. One place where this happened was on the Johnson Farm in Delphos, Kansas, November 2nd, 1971. The strange marks in the middle there are a ring of soil affected by a UFO. There are a whole host of tests run on the ring. It's clear that something strange happened to the soil as far down as 14 inches deep. To give you an example of what happens to soil, the soil on the left was from that ring, obviously different in color and texture, and I might say from laboratory tests also different in composition, from the normal soil on the right.
As long as UFOs remain in the air and perform impossible acrobatics, We can all enjoy arguments about who is hallucinating. And the military can tell the anxious citizens you did not see a flying saucer. That was Venus, or swamp gas, or migrating geese, or whatever. But all that changes when a UFO lands and aliens disembark. One of the most amazing and agonizing of such experiences involved a couple named Betty and Barney Hill. While driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire in 1961, the Hills lost several hours on the road. Unable to account for the missing hours and plagued by recurring dreams, they finally sought psychiatric help. While under time regression hypnosis, both Barney and Betty Hill relived being taken aboard a strange, glowing craft manned by beings not of this earth. While aboard, they were given an extensive medical examination and told that they would not remember what had happened to them. This is a model of one of the UFO occupants as described by Betty Hill under hypnosis. They were under 5 feet tall, with grayish skin, and communicated by some sort of thought transmission. In contrast, the creatures that floated toward Charles Hickson appeared to have been servo mechanisms or robots. The pointed spike ears prompted astronaut Brigadier General James McDivitt to suggest that they were probably some kind of advanced radar device.
Another version of what they look like, this is a drawing made by an artist, a composite based on hundreds of eyewitness reports. And obviously most landings don't get reported. This character's about 4.5 feet tall or so, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head and a body, slightly different facial features, obviously not like any of our friends down here on Earth.
However, there are definite parallels in behavior. They have Earth excursion modules, which behave very like our lunar excursion modules. Take our Apollo program. We have strange-looking flying craft carried on board a launch vehicle. They hover out in the boondocks on the moon, land, a couple of humanoid-looking creatures climb out, wander around, pick up rock samples, play games, then re-enter their craft, lift off, disturbing the soil behind them, rendezvous with the mothership, and zip off toward another planetary body. The same sequence, in fact, that have been observed here by UFO witnesses.
One of our pioneer astronauts was Brigadier General James McDivitt. In 1965, General McDivitt spent 4 days in outer space as command pilot of Gemini 4. General McDivitt, have you ever seen a UFO?
Yes. During my flight on Gemini 4 in 1965, I saw an object in space fairly close to our spacecraft that I could not identify. It looked to me like maybe the upper stage of another rocket. I tried to take some pictures of it, but unfortunately the pictures did not come out properly. We never were able to identify what it was, and all of our ground radar tracking data indicated that there shouldn't have been another object anywhere near us at the time.
General McDivitt, do you know anyone else who claims to have seen a UFO?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I know all kinds of people who claim to have seen them. Some of them are very legitimate, and some of them I think are just having fun. I had an opportunity recently to meet a gentleman from Mississippi who claims to have actually been taken into a spacecraft. And quite frankly, I believe that that gentleman is telling what he considers to be the truth. He wasn't looking for publicity. He wasn't trying to be funny. He was trying to be very honest. He was very sincere. And quite frankly, I walked away from the whole conversation with him believing that what he said is true as far as he's concerned.
Can you tell me about the lie detector test? When they were asked to come over here to talk to these people, they had in their mind that it was just a big joke. And if I understand it correctly, they ran one test on Mr. Hickson. The machine showed that he was telling the truth. Then they run another one. And then the examiner, he began to wonder himself. So he ran the 3rd test, and he believed just what Mr. Hickson had told him.
Sheriff Diamond, can you tell me just what happened that night?
We questioned him at length. And then we left the room and recorded every all the conversation they had, recorded between the two of them. And one of them kept wanting to pray. And he said, after all I went through on this earth, he said, why should I have to see something like this?
Calvin Parker, I was questioning him, and at one time he wanted to climb the wall. That's how nervous and how shook up he was.
But since I was down there, and since I was a physician, and several other scientists and investigators were asked to consult and look into the situation, I was asked would I mind if I would be present, and I said I wouldn't mind at all. And while it is still very difficult for us to believe that a spaceship landed and that robot-type creatures came out and actually took these two people into the spaceship, these men, in my opinion, believe that they saw this and that they were being honest in reporting what they have reported.
Charles Hickson's story is not unique. UFOs first soared into the news in this country in 1947 when pilot Kenneth Arnold saw 9 disc-shaped objects skimming along at high speed and in an unconventional manner, like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. A newspaperman who interviewed Arnold coined the term flying saucer, and over a quarter century of sky watching began. For 28 years, these metallic disc-shaped craft, tens of meters in diameter, have been seen around the world, from Paris to Papua to Pascagoula. Although science has failed to supply a generally accepted explanation of UFOs, the subject has been investigated by the United States Congress. In 1968, Congressman J. Edward Roush of Indiana chaired the House Committee on Sciences and Astronautics Symposium on UFOs. Congressman, do you believe UFOs are somebody else's spacecraft?
Well, I hesitate in answering the question only because of this. I don't know, but my imagination tells me that perhaps, just perhaps, there is something that would permit a man to travel faster than light. Perhaps there is something that would permit an intelligent form of life from another planet revolving around another star to make that long trip.
And that way they left out hundreds of reports by...
For more than 20 years, Major Donald E. Kehoe, U.S. Marine Corps retired, has been reporting on the world of flying saucers. I understand, Major Kehoe, that like physicist Stanton Friedman, you believe that we are being visited by intelligently controlled vehicles from other planets.
I do, and I agree with the Air Force. They've had a secret conclusion to that effect since 1948.
Ago, I conducted a symposium here on Capitol Hill, and the participants of the symposium were scientists of some renown. They were scientists who had an interest in UFOs, and during the course of that symposium, photos were presented which purported to be UFOs.
One of the scientists who analyzed the photographs at Congressman Roush's hearings was Dr. Robert M.L. Baker, Jr., who has consented to evaluate for us 2 UFO films from the files of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C.
We see here the Montana 1950 film showing 2 bright objects taken by Nicholas Mariana of Great Falls, Montana. The natural phenomena that is often given as a source of these images is airplane reflections. Airplanes, unless moving at unrealistically high speeds, would have to be so close to the observer as to be identified as airplanes in order for them to portray the kind of motion seen on the film. I don't concede these images to be airplanes, airplane reflections, comets, or other well-understood natural phenomena.
We don't know whether these are sophisticated weapons. Everyone denies that they are. Our own country denies that they are sophisticated weapons of this country.
This film was taken in 1952 by Delbert Newhouse, a Navy photographer, near Tremonton, Utah. He estimated that there were approximately a dozen metallic objects shaped like 2 saucers, one inverted on top of the other. The official explanation was that the objects were a flock of soaring gulls. But Dr. Baker had this to say.
Birds, such as gulls, simply don't make the kinds of accelerated turns at high speeds that were measured on the film. There also exists some meteorological data that would indicate that there were no updrafts that could have allowed the birds to maintain flight for long periods by simply spiraling.
It would seem more likely to me that it is some natural phenomena or even possibly something from outer space.